tax of 100 euros per ton of carbon dioxide today. 60 countries in the world have a price on carbon, lower than that though, but they have a price on carbon. The social cost of carbon is in the order of 200 US dollars per ton of carbon dioxide today. The damage caused is at 200 today. Let's just take 100. 100 multiplied by 40 gives us 4 trillion US dollars today if we would apply a price on carbon. So we can think of these investments to truly change the game on our inertia that we have today. But it would require a dividend system for socially help the low-income households, to help a landing for all communities across the world. It would require putting the multilateral development banks on a track to decommission coal-fired plants, to move away from that risk, which is the low-hanging fruit in the energy mix. And finally, to start building green capital stocks and reduce fossil fuel-based capital stocks. So I think it's doable, but it requires a massive effort.
Thank you very much for those initial impressions. I think we should give him a round of applause. It was very compelling. Right. So, Secretary Kerry, I think Professor Rockström has given us a pretty good impression of where we're at, but I just want to find out from you where you think the world stands in achieving the targets set in the Paris Climate Agreement.
Doesn't want me to say what I have to say. I think the world's in a really dangerous place with respect to the response that is required. And I think Johan, who I have enormous respect for and I talk to frequently, has really painted a picture of the science reality. And what bothers me so much, and I'm sure Jennifer feels the same way, we just chatted earlier this morning, you know, we can win the battle, but we're not behaving like we can. And because of the choices we are making and not making, both, we are courting the disaster that was described. Now, make no mistake about it, we are not on track to do Paris right now. We're on track to hit maybe 2.5 degrees or higher, but somewhere in that vicinity. Anything anyway above 1.5 does not avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. That's what the scientists have told us. And there's a reason we're here. There's a reason we talk about this imperative of dealing with the climate crisis. It's not because some president of a country or some member of a parliament said, oh, let's have a big issue, you know, we'll create our own Brexit kind of deal or whatever it is. No, we're here because of science, because of mathematics and physics. We know exactly what is happening to the planet. What is our challenge? Our challenge is emissions. That's what it is. Where do the emissions come from? The way we have chosen to heat our homes, light our businesses, travel. I mean, that's it, folks. And we know what we have to do. We have to curb the emissions. How do you curb the emissions? You have to shift demand for some of the things we're doing today. But equally importantly, you've got to change the choices you're making about how you provide that energy. Now, I thought we decided that in Paris and before. But here we are rolling along with a whole bunch of folks saying, oh, no, we need a new generation of gas structures or whatever, et cetera. I'm not saying gas is not. Gas is part of the solution. We do need some gas. But we've got to start capturing even the emissions of gas at a certain point in time. As you get to 2030, if you haven't reduced the emissions by 45% on a global basis, you can't achieve net zero by 2050.
Yeah.
And if you can't achieve that by 2050, you blow through 1.5. You blow through 1.5, you have the worst consequences beginning to happen. Now, already on the planet, we see people moving, people dying of overheat. People die, 15 million people die every year because of the lack of quality of air. Where's that come from? A thing called pollution. The pollution, greenhouse gases. So we're just not connecting the truth of what we know and of what science tells us every day with the choices and actions we are making. Yes, we've made some progress. We've made some progress. And we have a lot of money beginning to go into green hydrogen or direct air carbon capture or storage or batteries. That's all good. The problem is not that. It's that we're not doing it at the scale that we need to do it to meet the scientific goals.
Right. And of course, this is all happening against the backdrop of a war that's unfolding in Ukraine. And so I'd like to find out from you, Jennifer, what is this war and how does it impact progress towards net zero, if at all?
Well, I think the Russian war of aggression obviously has had tremendous impacts in a number of different ways. I mean, I think, first of all, it's been a wake-up call about how one shouldn't be dependent on one country for one's energy, but also the risks of fossil fuels themselves. And so I think seeing that, experiencing that, Germany has phased out all of our imports of Russian fossil fuels and has worked to build up our renewables by passing the largest energy bill in our history. Also working, this is in the engine room that needs to be accelerated, getting it so that you can install a wind turbine in 2 years, not 7, right? I mean, 7 years, we have to have global emissions, and we're talking about it takes 7 years. So working on that, getting the efficiency. It's also an all-of-society approach. I mean, we had people in Germany save 14% of energy this year. Companies saved even more than that, so to reduce that demand. So on the one hand, I think, and we didn't know when we were going through this, I think Germany has come out stronger and we are more resilient and we've been able to keep our climate goals and the energy security together. Do we need to do more? Absolutely. Yeah. So we have a lot to do more. But of course, the impacts that happened last year are absolutely astonishing. I mean, if you think of what happened in Pakistan, you look at the Horn of Africa, you look at the fires, you look at the droughts, and of course, the world, well, I should say, we know also that there are conflicts happening in other parts of the world, right? And I think that's another, I'll just make that my third quick point. But the time and the energy, around that and, and how much attention that would get, I think it hasn't been as much. And that's understandable when you're in the middle of this Russian aggression. But I think there's still been action moving forward, but not enough, far from it. And the third point I think is very interesting, and it's the one maybe that gives me a bit of hope, is that I think that it's really put a turbo underneath how we as the United States, as Germany, as Europe, work with our partners to build up renewable energy, whether it be UAE, where we're working together on green hydrogen, whether it be looking at what we can be doing in South America, just back from India, where the solar industry is ready to boom. And I think the dynamism, because it's created a disruption. And my experience is when there is disruption, that is when unusual or unexpected change and pace and scale of change can happen. But it's not fast enough, it's not big enough, and that's what we need to accelerate together.
It could be, though, Mariam, that this is the opportunity to then forge a more robust climate action that can withstand these geopolitical changes. Looking forward at COP28, is this what is on your mind?
Absolutely. First of all, I know the scene doesn't look good. We know the global stocktake is going to be shown, the results of the first global stocktake is going to be shown at COP28. We know already from now that we're completely off track. But I think what's important here is, the UAE has a huge opportunity here to do something. I think we've proven ourselves to be bridge builders. There's a lot of projects already and partnerships we've already initiated in the last few months. And I really believe the team of Sultan and Razan and Shemma have the skill set to really bring that consensus. We need to really unlock finances. We need to get the global south to feel that there's hope in this and to feel that there are solutions that can be scaled up. I mean, we just look at our own countries where we have political will, where we have resources, and we're struggling in this transition, and we've got challenges in this transition. Then I look at other countries that maybe don't have those fundamental things. It's going to need a huge legwork from all of us to assist each other. So I really think COP28, again, I know there's a big pressure as well to do it, but I really believe the UAE can deliver a COP that is a COP for all, that is a COP for action and practical solutions, and really scale up.
A COP for all. So what steps then can be taken between now and COP28 to advance this multilateral approach that you're talking about?
Lots of steps. So the energy transition, a just energy transition is one of them, but we need to think of food systems transformation. We need to think of the water security issue. We need to think of health. By the way, and I'm really happy to see that this climate dialogue is happening here as well at the Munich Security Conference, because really climate action and security is now completely interlinked. With all the conflicts that are going on, it's so important that we keep focus on the climate agenda. It is our biggest threat to us all. And it's actually, sometimes when I speak to some countries, it's sadly something has to happen for them to realize, oh, maybe we should invest more in overcoming the barriers of climate and looking at investing in a net zero pathway. I mean, I'm looking at the UAE, what we're doing. I mean, we're stepping up in all areas. We're working on our third NDC. We're working on a net zero pathway. Even myself, I'm in charge of the domestic efforts when it comes to climate action. The conversations I have to make sure that they understand this is pro-growth and pro-climate, and that this is a pathway that we must take. But they have to also see that there are, let's say, values in doing this, because they'll be attracting new skills.
Other capital to the table. So with about, with about 250 million to 500 million of our money, we leveraged $10 billion of public investment and another $10 billion of private investment. So the UAE is now, the Indonesians have set a target of reducing their coal use and deploying renewables. We're doing the same thing with Mexico with a different sort of a bespoke formula. We're doing it with Vietnam. We are going to work together with Germany and Norway with respect to the deforestation challenge in Brazil. And we're trying to do this, but the challenge is each of these arrangements, what have I listed? 3 or 4 countries? Takes a year and a half. We can't do that. We don't have that kind of time. We need to have much more capital available, much more concessionary funding available, so that the marketplace will say, wow, there's money available here. We can make this investment and over the long term be making the right investment, which is where corporate responsibility is also so important to winning this battle. I said earlier that we can win this only for a little while longer, the rate we're going, but we can. And if you look at all the promises that were made in Glasgow and put on the table, and the individual initiatives like the First Movers Coalition, the Green Shipping Challenge, the Methane Pledge, if all of those things are done, the IEA tells us we would be at 1.8 degrees of warming by 2050. Now, they're not being done, but if they were, that's the realm of possibility. Sharm el-Sheikh told us that with the additional promises of Sharm el-Sheikh, we could be at 1.7 degrees. Now, that assumes a remarkable amount of production of the promises. That's not happening, tragically. So we have this gap, and that's what Johan was referring to. Time is running out on us. There are such a thing as these scientific tipping points. I don't think anybody can tell you precisely where that is, but we know that there's a point of no return where the melting is too far gone. You can't restore what was there. If you lose the Greenland ice sheet, for instance, over the next several hundred years, that's 7 meters of sea level rise. That's a reason why UAE is saying we've got to step up and deal with this issue now, and that's a reason why so many of us are growing a little frustrated over the fact that there's a lot of talk and not enough action. And we have to come together more appreciably. We're here at a security conference. How much climate discussion has there been at a security conference where if you don't move the way we're talking about, you will have a health crisis, a food production crisis, and a real physical security challenge when people by the tens of millions are moving and you have increased conflict, ripeness for terrorism, and ripeness for conflict. So the military will tell you, climate crisis is a threat multiplier, and we need to eliminate those threats and begin to get ahead of this curve.
Now, you did speak about the irreversible damage to from climate change, and Inez Grace is a founder and chief executive officer at the Greenpeace Protector in Kigali, Rwanda, and she has a first question, which I know is on loss and damage. Inez, please. Inez.
Thank you so much. My name is Ineza, and I'm also part of the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. So in the spirit of corrective advancing climate action, for me, I think the first step is to acknowledge that climate change is existing.
Can you pull the mic a little closer?
Sure. So there's a need to acknowledge that climate change is happening now, and that it's existing. And we know that that since in the 90s, small island countries been demanding concrete action to be taken, especially on the reversible climate change impact that refer to loss and damage. But we also know that at COP27, the world did listen when we saw the establishment of the loss and damage finance, which is a breakthrough. But still, we have question on whether this finance is going to be accessible, new, and transparent, and that the finance that's going to be committed is not going to be double counting. So those questions still remain to be answered, and hopefully before COP28. But for me here, my question is to the panel: what is different right now? What can you send as a message to the current generation, especially youth generation, that now the global climate policy is taking the joint-driven action seriously in terms of really deploying the solution? And because now we are hearing information that like other global crises are suffocating the voice and the concern of those who are at the front line.
Yeah.
And now we also know the truth that, for example, other solution that is existing, especially for Africa Adaptation Project, they're not receiving the adequate finance. So what is different right now? Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I think it's two parts to that question. The first being, can we have faith that the money will be released, and what is different? Do you want anyone specific to take your question? You do, Mariam.
Yes,
Go ahead.
I'd love, first of all, I'm so happy to see young faces here as well, because it's really about your future. I'm also happy to tell you that the UAE has announced a youth climate champion for the first time. This is part of how we want to innovate and change a little bit the process of the UNFCCC, because we feel the youth shouldn't just be part of a delegation, but no, they have to have a much, much stronger input and influence on the process itself. That's the first thing. On the Loss and Damage Fund, yes, this was one of the wins of COP27. Now it's the COP28 presidency to make sure that that gets operationalized, and I know that Sultan, Shema, and Razan are working to make sure that that's an outcome at COP28, at least by that time. And also, I think what's so important here is, as I said, the kind of partnerships with the Global South. The financing plays such an important role in the mitigation, adaptation, and the loss and damage as well. I think there's now a much stronger willingness by multilateral banks for this reform and to rethink how to unlock the trillions that is needed to flow in to really push these projects. So thanks a lot for the
Professor Rockström, I'd like to hear from you regarding not necessarily what is being done differently, but what can be done differently.
Yeah. No, so there's a lot that has happened and is happening. I mean, to begin with, what is an enormous step forward is that we can scientifically today, through attribution research, connect the responsibility for extreme events to our human-caused global warming. So in Pakistan, for example, the biggest loss and damage occurrence last year, with a bill of in the order of $30 billion US, it's now shown through the attribution research that at least 50% of the extreme rainfall, 5 to 7 times of average monsoon rainfall, I mean, it's just extraordinary, devastating disaster, was caused by our human emission of greenhouse gases. This is a fundamental input to the whole loss and damage agenda. It helps the loss and damage agenda. I would argue, though, that despite the enormous importance, I would advise us not to get stuck in loss and damage, because loss and damage, we can end up just debating that forever. It has to be solved. But we have to recognize that the best way of reducing loss and damage is to decarbonize the world economy. We have to get on the mitigation pathway as support for loss and damage, because we are very close, and that's also scientifically now established, reaching limits of adaptation, meaning collapse and displacement and conflict rather than having anything to invest in and compensate for. So we don't want to end up there. I mean, it's a kind of a social tipping point of the kind that we do not want to face.
Right. You also had something to add.
Yeah, I also wanted to comment. I mean, I think the issue of climate justice is fundamental. And I think at COP27, it was a very big priority for Germany and the European Union to work with the most vulnerable countries to finally get a result that they've been working for 30 years, right? And I think now, as Mariam was saying, it's the job to put together a governance structure and to do it in a way that also builds trust, that we listen to each other, that we don't just go into a north-south fight, but we actually figure out, okay, and this is in all of the decisions, what is currently happening on, it's about averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. What's currently happening in all of in the ecosystem that is out there? And what are the gaps for addressing, which is what we heard from the most vulnerable countries was the biggest priority. And how do we make this fund about the vulnerable countries? That was a key component of that decision. And then how do we fund it? And there, I think, also in the decision, innovative financial sources. So the Secretary General has come out and said, windfall profits in the oil and gas industry, maybe that's an idea. But that's also where I think civil society is so important to be playing a role in putting out ideas there of what can come in. It's clear from the decision it's not only developed countries, so we have to negotiate that. That will be very challenging, but I think is a very important piece. And so those are the pieces that we need to get moving in good faith. But I think the other thing, and this links to what is different. Loss and damage fund happened because of those countries, but it also happened because of movements and the focus of movements around the world, of youth, of NGOs, et cetera. We need those movements, and those movements are now present. That is different. All around the world, you're here. I mean, it's amazing. So having the energy into getting the cuts in emissions that we need in an equitable, just way. So that climate justice is also about how we secure energy services through renewable energy, not fossil fuel. How we accelerate that pace so that we're not, we're actually able to phase out fossil fuels. And I think, the hope is, and this is where I think the movements will be so important, that we can come out of the COP28 with a clear signal that renewables is the way that we're going, with a clear signal that we're phasing out fossil fuels. And that's different. That's a different conversation, and the movements have been key, and that's part of why we're here. Thanks.
And just to follow up on that, how do we ensure that we're not digging one hole to fill in the other? I'm thinking of a transition into electric cars, for example, and the sort of ecological damage that extraction of lithium is causing in some places. How do we avoid that?
Well, I think we have to be very much with our eyes wide open on that, and we need to put in place environmental and social and human rights standards around that. First of all, we have to be doing the research to try and find replacements. Second, we need to recycle and reuse these materials as much as we possibly can, so we reduce the demand. And third, where it is needed, which there will be a demand for this, and find alternatives to lithium, for example, which is a big question that's out there, and how to do that. And there's already some work happening on that, thank goodness, with startups and innovation. And that's where we need the market signals and the financing to drive that. It's about doing it right, not extractivism, not continued extractivism out of developing countries, but actually looking at how can countries that have those resources be able to provide local benefits to the communities, limit environmental damage, and also provide an income source for those countries.
Well, I'd like to open the floor. Oh, we already have a question. Please, sir, go ahead.
Two questions, please. One on the World Bank, now under new management. should the World Bank continue to finance fossil fuels? And the second question, what is the scope for compromise between Europe and the US on the IRA? Sorry to identify myself, I'm Jeevan Vasek, I'm climate editor at Tortoise Media in London.
I see you looking at Secretary Kerry. I assume the question is for him.
What was the second part of the question?
The first question, the World Bank.
I got the World Bank.
Okay,
What's the other?
second, what is the space for compromise between Europe and the US on IRA?
Oh, okay. I'm not being rude and I'm not being arrogant, but I'm tempted to say Europe should sort of get over it. The truth is Europe should do the same thing. That's really what should happen. I've just described to you, and Johan and everybody here has described a world which is not transforming fast enough. And please, I'm totally joking when I say the get over it piece of it. Europe is our partner. We wouldn't have a solar industry if it weren't for Germany that sustained support for the solar industry when, it was nascent and wasn't going to be there. So, we're locked together in this, and we're really a partner going forward to try to solve this problem. I think President Biden's indicated he's perfectly prepared to sit and chat, work through those things that are deemed to be perhaps a challenge to trade norm or somewhat chauvinistic. And that'll happen. We'll get there. But I'm not joking when I say to you, everybody should do the same thing. What we're doing is stimulating increased investment. We have a production tax credit. We have an investment tax credit. And a load of people are going to come to the table and try to invent something or deploy something to the marketplace to solve this problem. So we need everyone around the world to be picking up the pace. Fatih Birol at the IEA will tell you that to achieve our goal of net keeping 1.5 degrees limit, we need to be deploying renewables 5 times faster. We need to be shutting coal 6 times faster. We need to be deploying electric vehicles 20-some times faster. Now, I think that figure has changed because suddenly it was happening, and now you have a 90% penetration of electric vehicles in Norway. You have 15% in the United States, for heaven's sakes. And it's moving so fast that people are waiting 1, 2, 3 years for the vehicle that they want. So demand is there. And I think that ultimately this will even out. There will not be a problem with the IRA. There will be more sort of similar kinds of efforts to attract people to the table. And that will be one of the things, hopefully, that helps us break through faster. On the MDBs and the World Bank, we are obviously, President Biden's going to look very carefully at the successor and put somebody there that he feels is prepared to try to move the banks into a different position, modernity, if you will. Those banks were not meant to be the fuelers of fossil fuel or of normal standard transactions. They're meant to be development banks, and they're meant to take a certain element of risk. So they have AAA standing today, and frankly, they've been, many of them, behaving very similar to any other bank and any other standard. We need them to be leveraging bigger deals, more deals, faster deals. We need them to become part of the concessionary component of finance. That's not losing the money. Remember, we're a shareholder. We're the top shareholder. Germany's a shareholder. We don't want to be driven to come back to the table to have to replenish capital because a bunch of bad decisions were made. But I think most people in the business of development, most people in the climate sphere who are trying to push action would tell you that the banks, until very recently, some of them are now doing much better. The Asia Development Bank, the European, the African have really been more aggressive than the World Bank. But we need to see much more effort. There will be reform initiatives put forward at the April meetings of the banks. And again, further, I'm confident, because not everything will be done at one time, there'll be further efforts in the fall meetings, I'm sure. But what we need now is for those banks to be part of the transition and leading the transition. And they can lead that transition by being a little more discerning about what kinds of things they choose to fund. Should they be funding new fossil fuel initiatives? No. Why? Because we very clearly don't need the new ones according to the IEA if we were moving fast enough to provide greater supply of clean energy, which is available to us. The problem is there's very high demand right now. And that has come about because of unforeseen circumstances of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. And that cut off gas, all of a sudden the whole marketplace was disrupted in a way that raised prices enormously, has produced new profits, and has created a new debate about whether or not that is the direction we need to move in. I think everybody sitting here would say, no, that's not the direction we need to move in. What we need to do is begin to reduce the demand by putting out, for instance, electric vehicles are going to reduce demand. Believe me, Ford Motor Company, General Motors Company have retooled their plants. They're not going back. It doesn't, you know, if for some reason a future president said, I want to change this, not happening. Because the whole marketplace, Germany likewise, Volkswagen, Porsche, Audi, Mercedes, they're all going electric. And the marketplace will be electric. And that means far less fuel being asked for. Therefore, the demand for loans for new oil projects is going to go down, and it will be replaced by new sources of clean energy, which is the only way we win this battle.
I hope you're satisfied with the answer. All right. We've got a few more questions. One from Nisreen there. We've got one here and one here. Please keep them brief.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Nisreen Al-Saim. I'm the previous chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Well, first of all, I wish we had someone from the French administration here, but it's fine. My main comment here is going to be about the Climate for Debt or Debt for Climate initiative and the summit that President Macron is going to host in June this year, how much difference it will bring to the countries that are hidden by all of the factors and have the perfect storm, as the Professor Hay mentioned, the COVID, the lack of infrastructure, the economical degradation, but the most important, the environmental and climate crisis and impact. It is very important to talk about the financial access to these countries, especially the countries that have political instabilities and countries that are under sanctions and countries that under have some sort of a international community boycotting for many reasons. The second thing is going to be about, for Your Excellency Mariam, how is UAE going to actually develop the discussion about climate change, peace and security at COP28? We had one initiative by the CCCPA at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, but it's not enough. And we are also glad to be here today in this session, but it's also not enough because climate change is actually disrupting the peace and security of the world, especially the Sahel region and many countries that are very fragile and very ready to are on fire, actually, because of climate change and because of conflicts over natural resources.
All right. For the interest of time, I'm going to have to ask you to leave it there. Thank you. I think we'll just take the answers very quickly before we move to the next one. Shall we work backwards and start with you?
Yes, I'll answer the second part of the question. So definitely the peace and security. I mean, I always tell people to keep climate change, to understand climate change, it's about respecting nature. And we've been disrespecting nature for a long time. And when we disrespect nature, it retaliates and fights back. And this is where so many other things start to multiply, as John also mentioned. And it's really key when we're thinking of mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, finance, which will be all the tracks that the COP28 presidency will be focusing on. It's really key to know that if we unlock the finances, if we have a global goal for adaptation, if we're able to slash our emissions by 43% by 2030, that is fundamental for peace and security. So They know that this is the center, or this is the blueprint that we need for peace and security in the world, and we have to get that right. And we have just a few years now. It's such a critical time now. The next 7 years are so critical to ensure the pathway that we're going to be going on.
Professor, you wanted to take the first question?
Yeah, and I just want to kind of add one dimension to this. I think what you pointed out earlier here about letting multilateral development banks be a bit more risk-taking, a bit more experimental, and operate in a way to really de-risk investment should, I believe, be coupled with the Debt for Climate initiative by putting very rigorous requirements on that debt release, by saying, for example, one could think of a major initiative of decommissioning coal-fired plants, and say that multilateral development banks purchase state-owned coal-fired plants and put a pathway to decommission them to help developing countries to accelerate the pathway off from fossil fuels, but do it in a very hands-on, partnership-based way. And that would release a lot of pressure on domestic financing, but I mean de-risking the whole journey, but also enable the North to be much more responsible and engage in that transition. And I think that would be worth doing, despite the fact that you're absolutely right, John, which you mentioned yesterday, that in the end it's 20 big countries in the world that dominate emissions, over 70% of emissions. So why put such large burden on the global South? Well, I think we need to also do that to be able to communicate to the world that these investments is the pathway to the next level of advanced economic development. This is not a sacrifice. This is the path to success. It's the path to have any chance of a modern future. So I think we should play the card also in the vulnerable countries in order to show the way that, you know, you get rid of the pollution impacts, you get rid of, if you look at Tanzania, large part of their foreign currency is for imports of fossil fuels. I mean, why would you do that in a vulnerable, fragile state? You want to become more resilient, and I think that should also be played as a card here on this debt for climate.
Okay, I had an answer to that, but it's not my place to be responding, so we'll get the next question.
I'm very interested to hear.
No, please. You had a question, yeah?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Judith Holzdorf. I'm also one of the Munich Young Leaders, and I'm from Germany. I remember Ambassador Heusgen said in his opening that war is diverting billions of necessary investments on climate change, more or less. And listening to many speakers and discussions here, I'm a bit worried that exactly that might happen. And it reminds me a bit of a year ago. The threat is very close, but somehow action is not really taken yet. Not saying there's non-action taken, but the urgency is not being recognized. And I really wonder, can we allow for this trade-off to happen, or to be a bit bold? Where's the 2% on climate?
Anyone you're directing the question to? Otherwise,
the governmental actors maybe, but...
Okay, Secretary Morgan.
Yeah, I mean, I think good question, and no, we can't allow it to happen. I think that's what we've been working on doing, but we need to do more, right? And seeing the interlinkages and how energy security and climate and peace go together. I think the issue of how we actually, and this is linked to the MDB reform, it's linked to the Bridgetown agenda, on how we meet the financial needs that are there is fundamental. I mean, Germany takes our climate finance commitments very seriously. We're looking very carefully at what the Bridgetown agenda has brought forward, which is also about debt. There's 60% of the world that's on within close to a debt crisis. But we need to rethink it. I think, and that's where these, so it's a mixture, right? It's how do you use public funding in a way that can unlock the trillions, right? And I think we know a lot about that, but somehow it's not being brought together in that kind of master, I mean, you're not gonna have a master plan, but in a way that catalyzes the different pieces that are there. And I think that's the opportunity of the reform of Secretary Yellen gave a very important speech last week on the reform of the World Bank, looking at what the regional development banks are doing and what we as shareholders are asking them to do. And I think, if I may, on the IRA question, I just want to say, I mean, we'll figure it out. We're figuring it out, so I'm not worried about that. And I mean, Europe has released a Green Deal industrial plan as well, right? The president, we're considering that. And I think Europe is actually far ahead. We've got the policies and measures in place to attract finance, so game on.
I like that. Game on. We had a question from the back. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Nina Bernardin, co-founder of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, and I have two really quick questions. One to Minister Almheiri. Do you agree with the goal that I believe State Secretary Morgan hinted at, that at COP28 we should aim finally for an agreement on phasing out fossil fuels? And then I have a question to State Secretary Morgan or Special Envoy Kerry. How do we ensure that a just transition is being done not detrimental to countries in the global south? And we've already talked about the risk of deprioritizing adaptation, or loss and damage. But what about what we're seeing currently, the tendency to outsource problems from countries in the global north by tapping into solar power, for example, in North Africa? Thank you.
Yes, definitely. We will be phasing out fossil fuel. And actually, I mentioned this in my panel yesterday. The UAE itself, it was our current president, he mentioned in the World Government Summit in 2015, he said, if we put the right investments today in the renewable energy sources, we will very soon, in a few years' time, be exporting the last barrel of oil, and we will be celebrating. So this is something he mentioned in 2015. The UAE itself, we have a plan. We're doing a two-pronged plan. We're ramping up our renewables, and we're decarbonizing our old energy systems. But at the same time, we also understand that there are other countries that are not at the same situation where we're at, and they will still need oil and gas. So we need to help them, and we need to ensure that every barrel that we're taking out with the lowest carbon footprint possible. So that's the responsibility that we're taking. So yes, we are phasing out, but again, this just energy transition, we always have to think of affordability as well in the context of that.
Yeah. By the way, the finance minister for Indonesia spoke very well about the jet fees. So if you're interested in that, you might find the recording from yesterday. But to your second question, you had directed it to either one of the secretaries.
I could do a quick start. I mean, I think we have to do it differently. I think what we're working to do is, I mean, in a way, they're with the disruption, with the acceleration of shifting to renewable energy, countries that never thought that this could actually be a source of income for them are now looking at renewable energy in a different way. But the first thing is that they have to meet their own energy needs, right? So that's why Project in Namibia is about actually meeting first the energy needs of Namibia and then looking at the export opportunities of the derivatives from green hydrogen or others to Europe. And in Brazil or in Colombia, what the conversation is, how do you create a bioeconomy, right, that is actually creates the alternatives for local farmers so they don't have to deforest, and how do we create those incentives and the different financial streams that make that work. And I think, you know, Europe is putting in place a deforestation-free supply chain directive. Well, we need to work together to build the capacity of the local farmers, for example, so that they can meet that. So it's a whole different, there's a moment of being able to create an alternative development plan for those countries. That's what I'm hearing about from them, and that's what we want to try and make happen so that it can not be extractive as it has been in the past. But we have to work at it. We have to get the standards. We have to work together. That's where, again, the collaboration and the dialogue and actually the actual standards for social, environmental, human rights are fundamental.
Right. You'd like to?
Yeah, I would like to, if I may. So I want to ask everybody to focus in on something that Johan emphasized that I had said yesterday at some point. I want to reiterate it in this context. The problem of a just development is not exclusively in how we do the transition of responding to the climate crisis. Why do I say that? I say that because 48 sub-Saharan African states equal 0.55% of the emissions, which are the problem. So what they need is development, normal development, and they don't get it. The development to be able to have, I mean, the cost of capital in Africa is 300, 400% above other parts of the world. That's where your development banks are supposed to go to work. And that's where development can make the difference. But with respect to a just transition, the most important single thing, in my judgment, are the 20 nations that equal 76% of all the emissions need to step up. If we do that, if those 20 countries will meet the targets we're on, the spillover of their technology, the spillover of their process, excuse me, will become the norm of what the World Bank and other people are funding for development in Africa. So it's not a climate, it's a downstream climate crisis for many countries in the world because they're impacted by what the 20 plus countries are doing. I think it's something like, well, you have 20 countries that are at the top, emitting, but most countries are at 2% of emissions or below. I think there are about 9 countries, 10 countries that are at 1% and 2% in between. Every other country in the world is below 1%. So, folks, those 20 countries got to step up. Now, I'm proud to say, I'm going to be, defensive here for what we're doing. Germany, the EU, US, Japan, Korea, and Canada have all stepped up with legitimate NDCs, plans to reduce their emissions to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And they will hit their targets by 2030 to have the 45% reduction. But we have countries that are not deciding to do that, big economies. And they are continuing to build coal plants, continuing to not transition in a rapid way that they could. So that's the challenge for us here, is how do we get all 20, and then a plus. There are those few other countries I said in between. If they will do what's necessary here, we win this battle. And that's how you get a just transition. If they don't, that's where the injustice is going to come from, by the damage that has continued to be done all around the world.
Wow.
And there's no way to solve this for any one country. We could go to zero tomorrow. EU and US, if they went to zero emissions tomorrow, you'd still have the crisis. So everybody is in this together, and we have to begin to behave like we're all in it together.
Okay, we have 5 more minutes, which means one more question. Does anybody want to?
One behind you.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Daniel Eriksson, CEO of Transparency International. It is great that the world is getting around and focusing on this problem and that money is flowing into climate finance. But what we have seen in the pandemic, what we see now with Ukraine, is that when a lot of money is going out really quick, there's a risk of corruption. And particularly now with climate financing, we know that about 40% is going to state with a high degree of propensity for corruption. There's 2 risks with that. The first and obvious one is that not all the money goes to where it's needed. The second one that we keep forgetting is that those countries which tend to be autocratic, that money can go in, the corrupt siphoned off money can go into the pockets of those autocrats, driving conflict, creating a spin. By no means am I saying that we should reduce climate financing, but my question here, maybe to the professor or John Kerry, are we doing enough to fight and ensure that there's no corruption in the support that is going out?
All right, Professor, we'll wrap with you.
No, just to say very short that this is something that I'm really concerned with as well, and I know that across the scientific community this is a big concern because we are getting a better handle on the quantifications, on the pathway to mitigation, but also the financing required. And we're talking going from billions to trillions, so you're absolutely right. The absorption capacity, the institutional, the transparency, the MVR agenda of monitoring, verification, reporting is absolutely fundamental. And we know that we are lacking here, and we need to have innovations there. And I think that's where the MDBs have to step up even further to be very actively part in these transitions. That's why I proposed this. We've been discussing that for quite some time now about decommissioning coal-fired plants by having them invested through very tight investment schemes, not just to throw out the money, but to actually be part in the whole transition.
Does anybody want to add to that, or we can conclude this conversation here?
Important issue, I'll just say. Yeah.
Sorry?
Very important issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I really thank you for your question. And so with that, I think we've wrapped before time. This is quite impressive for an African such as myself. We're not very good with timekeeping, but I'd like to thank my panel for your contributions. Thank you so much to our audience for your attention and as well as your questions. Asanteni.
Thank you.
Thank you.